Welcome to a brand new episode of the Greentech Pulse, where we explore different ways businesses can use technology in ensuring better sustainability and and environmental sustainability too. Today's guest mentioned something really interesting when we were speaking just now. He mentioned that 76% of electricity used in the United States and 40% of CO2 emissions also come from the built world. So that's from buildings, big buildings, and everything. And that's a statistic that if you weren't in this field, you would never expect to hear. Today's guest is Bert Van Hoof. He's from Willow, and Willow does something interesting. I'm sure we've heard about AI everywhere, but Willow does something really interesting with AI. It uses AI to reduce those emissions and make buildings more sustainable. I won't go in. I'll let him say that because I'm not from Willow. He's the expert. So welcome to Greentech Pulse, Bert.
Well, thank you, Peter. I'm very, very happy to be here and love how you bring a diverse perspective on all kinds of approaches and technologies to the space. So, yeah, we're here today for something different than what you've covered so far. So, I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, I think I've been loving the episode so far because I just learned something brand new every time. Yeah. So for I didn't go into the description of what you do because I'll leave that to you. So for those who might not be familiar with Willow, can you briefly explain what Willow does and the problem you're trying to solve?
Yeah, we're an AI-driven digital twin for the built world, right? And that means any type of structures and infrastructure. Yeah, our mission statement goes create a world where every building on the planet responds to the people, purpose, and environments they serve. It's one of those cool statements. There's a lot packed into that. You know, you start with the 25-page white paper, and ultimately, 2 years later, you have to distill it down to the one liner. It's a pretty powerful statement in that, you know, we say create a world because that world doesn't yet exist or not at scale, right? So we see this as an opportunity, just like urbanization or Airbnb kind of massive shift in a specific industry. And there's a strong belief and conviction on our side that the way people are managing all these buildings, these facilities of all kinds, which we can get into a bit more, it's just not sustainable for a number of reasons. Not from just the traditional sustainability aspect, but you know, when you go to these different building types, and as mentioned, there's all the different types. When you think about the different industry segments that we play in, think of education. Well, smart buildings are smart education campuses, right? And there's a lot going on. There's this obviously the purpose there is buildings are never built to be buildings, right? The purpose in that context is to obviously learn and educate people, and the people are faculty and all the students that use those buildings. And the environments they serve is obviously there's the broader environment, but then there's labs, there's classrooms, there are athletic facilities, and in many cases here in the United States, big stadiums for college football, etc. Right, so they're pretty diverse environments. So that's one example of a specific industry, specific lens into that. When we think of retail, you have stores, right? Some of our customers have what are called super centers. They're pretty massive constructs in them of themselves. They have large pieces of refrigeration, which are very highly energy consuming, and at the same time there's refrigerants and all kinds of other things that become quite interesting. And they're not coolers or refrigerators we use in our homes, right? They're like a complex HVAC system. They have rooftop units, and there's compressors and condensers and entire racks that get fed off of that. And some of them operate at scale with if you look at some of the really big ones in the United States, that can be 10,000 stores with 500,000 coolers. Pretty significant environments. Once you look at retail, you also have warehouses and distribution centers. When you go to the health space, now you talk about a smart hospital, right, where we're also active. And you get into all kinds of unique situations, right? A lot of things are very specifically in common. They all have HVAC systems, they all have lighting. But then you have research labs, you have vent hoods that may interact with the HVAC system. You have things like operating rooms, the patient rooms have unique things. Comes back to that purpose. In that context, the purpose is obviously healing people and keeping them healthy and making them healthy. And the people are obviously the staff, the doctors, the nurses, and the patients, right? So in each of those settings, you have these specific correlations. We have done stadiums, right, where that's an entertainment setting. And there's all kinds of things around that. You have concession stands, you have high energy consuming commercial kitchen equipment, which, by the way, is one of those things people don't think about, but you find that in about any setting, right? There's a thing called the EIA does, the government body here does what's called the CBEX, the Commercial Building Energy Survey. And they do that roughly every 5 years. And there's well over 70 building types. And then you can, at the precision of long lat, go in every region and look at the specific energy profile. So if I say, well, I have a retail store of this much square footage in this specific location, they'll give you a very good approximation of what your energy consumption would be like. And that's kind of interesting. And they break it down where that energy goes. And depending on the building type, for commercial kitchen equipment, that can be 7 to 14% of your energy consumption. And it's all logical when you start to think about it, right? So there's always, I tell people, when you walk, drive, or fly around, what do you see? Buildings. We as humans, humanity functions in and around buildings, right? An inpatient hospital has that kind of equipment. Those schools have that kind of equipment, right? We do airports, right? DFW Airport's one of our key lighthouse accounts. It's the size of Manhattan, the whole setup. So it's a huge playground. And we started at some point in one terminal with a HVAC optimization plan, and then it fanned out. And now there's the digital glass that thins digitally. There's the watt stopper lighting. How do these systems intersect, right? Ultimately, when you dim the glass, you're going to affect the lighting need. In hot areas in summer, in particular in Dallas, it can be quite extensive. So the ability to tint the glass is quite significant. But then it affects lighting, it affects the heat on the floor plate, and how all these systems intersect. So that's all examples of how Willow plays into the mix. But in environments like that, we go all the way into water, doing leak detection, go to the passenger boarding bridges, the runway sensors, how the planes come to the apron. When a plane docks at passenger boarding bridge, there's what's called the ground power unit. That's not available everywhere, but more and more airports, that's the case. That's a big sustainability story, because there's the central utility plant. DFW is doing an E-Cup, fully electrical. Now the plane can plug in, basically, for both air and electricity. And if that's not the case, or if that doesn't work, then the plane's going to run the auxiliary power unit while people offboard the plane, basically. And you're burning jet fuel while you're doing that. So, and then you think about that, that's, scope 1 and scope 2, depending on whether you're the airline or the airport. But it affects both of their sustainability footprints. So optimizations in that regard are very important. And so that's kind of what we do when we say a digital twin. We build a digital replica of these real world assets, understand relationships between them. We ingest what we call spatial, static and live data. What that means is spatial data can be anything from 2D drawings to BIM models, building information modeling, 3D models. So you get a very rich view on that. And so those have been around for a while. Similarly, within the building, you typically have a BMS, a building management system. They're typically on-premise, more or less antiquated, but they always control the HVAC system, sometimes lighting, sometimes fire and security, but then it peters out pretty quickly. But now everything is getting connected, right? There's more and more systems coming into the mix, from your elevators, as I mentioned, conveyance is already something we're doing. There's luggage handling in an airport. In each of these different settings, as I mentioned, then you have operating rooms with all kinds of equipment in hospitals, etc. So how are all these things influencing each other? And that's what we do. We build a digital twin. Static data can be anything from riser diagrams, single line diagrams, warranty records, all the tickets that have ever been produced against physical assets over time, the operation and maintenance manuals, anything that we can get our hands on pre or post construction goes into the digital twin. And then the live data comes from all of those OT systems, IoT systems, the Internet of Things. Anything from smart lockers can now be connected in a hospital. You can't have hand hygiene monitoring. The faucets can be connected. So anything that's connectable, we will connect with live data. You have vent hoods in some research labs that may affect not only high energy consumption, but also how the pressurization of the building gets influenced with the HVAC system. So traditionally, none of these systems know about each other. They all function on their own little islands. And once you get a digital twin and you can bring all of that data together, model the relationships between them, you can start to do very advanced things. So that's all part of the AI narrative as well. So yeah, I'll pause there.
Yes, I think that's a lot of this thing: campuses, stores, malls, warehouses, hospitals, labs, stadiums, airports. So I think that now shows how much the impact of the built world, because these are really large structures which we have in almost every, not city, but at least every large group where you have a large group of people, you have a lot of this.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it's funny because you have the reaction a lot of people have. I spent 20 years at Microsoft before I joined Willow. And, that's where I really got bitten by the bug the last 9 years or so. We're in Azure, where I drove a lot of the Azure IoT efforts and Azure Digital Twins. And Willow became an early adopter of Azure Digital Twins. But even within Microsoft, who has all these industry verticals, there was always the challenge, I guess, that people's first reaction is they know about the residences they live in and potentially an office they go to, but they don't think about the built world as, yeah, it's literally everything we do and live our lives around, in and around, is all centered on buildings, right? That's what makes it so intriguing and such a passionate area for me right now, because now you have other challenges that are directly correlated, big secular trends around the need for grid modernization. Obviously, anybody who's not been hiding under a rock has seen some sort of stories around the AI revolution and the energy that takes, and all the data center build outs, massive numbers, right? And the grid was on this kind of steady line. I've been on the board of the Alliance to Save Energy for the past 8 years, and I've been chairing what's called the Active Efficiency Collaborative. And the organization works with the 3,000 or so utilities in the United States, and everybody who has an interest in energy and energy efficiency specifically has been a big focus there. But that whole narrative is now the traditional way people have been thinking about it is now shot, right? We cannot produce the electricity that's going to be needed fast enough. And any plans that have already been adjusted need to be adjusted again. And so we can't build this kind of capacity fast enough. And it's gonna, even if you went all in on nuclear, some of these would take 5 years to build. And you would need transmission line upgrades, etc. So in come some very important new concepts like grid interactive efficient buildings, which the DOE has been quite active on, and how they can be then plugged in to the concept of virtual power plants, right? If these buildings can be aggregated, and they can have a lot of the capabilities that Willow brings into the mix, then you can basically start to use them as a virtual power plant that can not only generate, because a lot of people think in that concept of generation, but also how can you curtail at critical moments, right? So the way the grid works in and of itself, you have all the marginal pricing and the marginal emissions. So obviously there's wholesale generation for massive solar and wind farms, all the way to new geothermal and all the renewable energies who've obviously been on a crossover trajectory and in some cases already exceeded that. And then you have the gas power plants and the coal power plants, which are obviously not that friendly for the environment. But the utilities have been, very, very clever and smart about only activating them when needed. But then you have the traditional duck curve. Now they talk about the canyon curve. And so typically when your energy is clean, it's also cheap, right? When you have a lot of wind and solar, obviously you can't turn off the sun when you're producing too much, or just turn off the wind farm blade on a dime. It doesn't work that way. So that's where in some regions, you get all the way to negative pricing. So if there was more use of battery storage, clever use in context of buildings as well, then you could load up those batteries at the right time, and at a time when you have basically huge needs at times of the day, and you don't have all your renewable energy, then also that's where marginally all these new other sources or old other sources come back into play, all the way to coal fire plants were needed. Well, if you can help avoid some of the situations because you have more and more pieces of infrastructure, not just single buildings in isolation, but these smart constellations like an entire campus, etc., that can smartly play into that. They become a grid interactive, efficient building. So you get the direct benefits of being more efficient to begin with, but at the same time, you're real-time aware of what the grid's needs and challenges are, and you can then play into that, and you can be paid for that, for the curtailment at the right times as well. So anyway, very important key concepts, but you cannot really get there with just traditional, on-premise building management systems. You do need something like Willow that comes into the mix. We can then bring in all the IT connections as well. We look at weather data, we look at real-time emissions data. So we look ahead, we look at real-time pricing, day ahead pricing, and we can start to reason over all that. And yeah, that's where it gets fun and interesting. And that's, as I mentioned, it's a secular trend. It'll be unstoppable. It's going to be needed to solve all of these gnarly problems, right? There's all these, I would say, there's all these next generation problems we have now. Some of them we touch upon, but there's a broader mix, even than that will require next generation solutions and the next generation workforce as well, which is also going to be interesting. One of the things you find in this sector broadly is that the aging population of technicians and operators, right? Deloitte ran an interesting study which basically concluded, as a very detailed breakdown, but 68% of operators, technicians in the space for real estate are above age 45, 21% are above retirement age, right? So people are hanging on for dear life. Part of that is knowledge, part of it is antiquated systems that young people don't want to touch. And so having an ability to do an overlay with something modern looking that has 3D aspects, has an AI co-pilot for young people, changes the narrative. Obviously, it does drive specific outcomes as well, but it also makes it a lot more compelling for young people to see this as a real job opportunity. So as part of the work that we're doing with education settings, as well as higher ed, is also to change that narrative and get to these next generation solutions.
Okay, so now for a lot of these buildings you've mentioned and that we mentioned earlier, most of these buildings were built long ago before we started thinking about the climate, thinking about sustainability and things like that. So now for let's say airports, school campuses, some of them are 400, 300 years old, 200 years old, or maybe 100 years old at least. So does Willow, how does Willow AI help to retrofit these buildings to help them be more sustainable? Maybe you can use an example of one of these really old buildings and show us how it works.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we run into this all the time, especially when you go to higher ed education, right? As you can imagine, our first customer in the space with a very visionary CIO and CFO, with Steve Burrell at NEU, Northern Arizona University, 128 buildings in play, and some of them are over 100 years old, and some of them were literally finished last year, right? So you have this broad spectrum, and you have to be able to deal with all of them. Now, granted, your options may vary on how much you can get your hands on, and what you can actually influence, but it's pretty clear we can do useful things in all cases, right? So part of that is also, um, you often end up with a situation where there's a bunch of rolls and binders somewhere in the basement on these buildings, and that doesn't mean that's a complete loss, right? So those things can be scanned in as well. You know, we use AI techniques now to, those are things that we used to use, like real architects, which we still have on staff. We have a bit of an army of them, deep mechanical engineers that could take that data and then model it into what we call the knowledge graph as part of the digital twin, right? This is where we model all of these entities and the relationships between them. And that could take hours, in some cases days, for very complex input materials to get that done. Well, now we started using AI techniques. We use LLM with vision, and then a bunch of cool Willow unique overlay and work we've done together with Microsoft as well. But where we can literally get the same result in minutes. And it's a multi-pass approach. Obviously, the LLM with vision only has a very small register of things it can look at the same time. So you have to keep context and then traverse a drawing on paper that was scanned in, for instance, but completely digitize that, not just on, hey, we digitize the lines or the drawing, but the interpretation of it, and understand from those the relationships, etc. So that's things you could do. Some people or some entities will go as far as, for things like airports, and say, hey, we'll deploy a LiDAR scan, and we're going to reconstitute the complete as-built 3D model, right? We can do those type of things as well. There's an extra cost that's in many cases not really necessary to get some of the results. So for buildings on an education campus, we would typically not do that. But if the customer wants to do that, there's a whole gradation of things we can do. There's typically still some BMS. In some cases, they have already been retrofitted. In some cases, we make a strong recommendation that they get to a more modern version or an upgrade from. That doesn't mean replacing the BMS, but make sure it's the last version of it, so we can tap into the most available APIs to control those things. So yeah, there's a wide range of options to really do useful things, even with very old buildings. And that's all been part of the journey to really, how do we democratize and scale this capability, right? Willow's been on the scene with this kind of capability 2017, really popped up in 2018 when they fully embraced Azure Digital Twins. And so we lived our own version of, I don't know if you're familiar with the Gartner hype cycles, but Gartner is notoriously known for what they call their hype cycles. So they look at all kinds of innovation spectra technologies. They have one for digital twins. They obviously do one for AI right now. They typically declare, here, there's an innovation trigger. Here's all the specific techniques. And they put them on a curve that has the same shape always. It's a pattern that returns. You go from innovation trigger to peak of inflated expectations. So you go straight up. AI has a lot in that department. There's a lot of debate whether we're already sliding to what they call the trough of disillusionment. Um, and then you go towards the slope of enlightenment and then the plateau of productivity. And so it's a curve that goes up all the way down and then it goes, ultimately you come out. What Gartner's trying to do with those curves is predict for any piece of specific technology, is it going to be a 1-year ride or a 10-year ride or a 15-year ride? How fast is it going and where exactly are you on the curve? So in their predictions right now, it's there's going to be a lot of trough of disillusionment around AI. That doesn't mean it's all bogus and not relevant. It means that people are struggling or abusing LLMs, right? There's a good conversation to be had here about when people say AI today, they often talk about Gen AI, generative AI, and LLMs, the large language models, right? ChatGPT and Claude and all those fun things that consumers play with now as well. Obviously, a big revolution there, but it's one of many AI techniques, and none of the other ones have died off, right? So there's all the non-generative approaches, machine learning, reinforcement learning, deep reinforcement learning, or deep learning and deep reinforcement learning, knowledge graphs, simulation techniques, optimization techniques, traditional rules and heuristics, and expert system type of behaviors. And the reason why that's relevant is that you can take all of those techniques and then apply certain use cases against it, and where each of the technique is most applicable. But now you have this notion of composite AI where it's clearly beneficial to use a multitude of techniques in combination sometimes to get the right cost, performance, and energy profile. Again, the LLMs are very expensive to run, and that's where they often get abused now to try and solve problems that they're really not optimized for. That doesn't mean they're wrong, but that means combined with some other AI technique, you could get better output basically, and that's something Willow does well as well across the spectrum. So yeah, very important to bring all those pieces together in the right way to get the outcomes you want and these kind of next generation capabilities and behaviors that will help you reduce costs, help you reduce carbon, but also help you reduce wear and tear. There's other cool things now that I'll give you one example, right? On highly applicable in office and certainly higher ed settings, but even in hospitals, occupancy-based HVAC control, right? So a lot of people have invested in occupancy systems that can now go all the way to people count, right? I can count the amount of people, it's anonymized, but I can count, and there's different techniques to do that. So different vendors and different sensor solutions to do that, but I can know with precision how many people are in a specific space or room at any given time. Well, when there's nobody there, the HVAC system works in isolation and is typically on a schedule and a sequence of operations, and it's going to come on in the morning at a certain time. In the good cases, there's a little bit of throttling to manage peak demands and demand charges by not boosting everything just at the same right time. But what if you could combine those systems, right? And that sounds like, why wouldn't you do that? Well, because it's been very hard to do that without something like Willow. But for us, this is now pretty trivial, where we can say, hey, if there's nobody there, we can throttle down on the sequence of operations to a lower setting. And turns out you save massive amounts of energy and therefore carbon in this case as well by doing that. And certainly in office buildings where hybrid work is now become the norm, right? So a lot of spaces aren't being used, but certainly in education settings, not all labs are used 100% of the time. Different buildings, like in weekends when there are sports activities, are going to see different or higher use, etc. And the same with classroom schedules. A classroom that's not booked or not used, you can set those back. And you can be smart about this. You can manage the classroom schedules, right? So you can be predictive. It's like, well, nobody's there, but we know 5 minutes from now there's supposed to be somebody there. But if 5 minutes later still nobody's showing up, you can still do all the smart throttling on that. So those are the key examples of very cool things we can do now very rapidly because of the inherent capabilities of the twin. Yeah.
Nice. All right. So now, the process, the sensors, the everything you described sounds a bit intensive, which means it sounds expensive too. And for a lot of these buildings, these are commercial buildings, and when people invest in a building, they want to get return on investment. So, for a typical commercial building implementing something like Willow, how long is the usual payback period for implementing this technology? Then, apart from that, too, apart from direct energy savings, what other benefits have clients seen from implementing these systems on their buildings?
Yeah, 100%. Well, first of all, I want to debunk the myth because it definitely triggered me on that one. As I mentioned, I spent my whole career um, scaling and democratizing solutions, right? And yes, digital twins were absolutely perceived as something for the happy few, right? When Willow came out in the early days and had these limited capabilities working itself through the Gartner hype cycle, as I mentioned, very common curve, where we had a lot of things that were necessary but not sufficient, right, for mass scale adoption. Some experts could do magical things, but it wasn't really easy necessarily for those operators and technicians to just take full advantage of it or have autonomous system behavior, as I just described, right? So all of those things were missing at the time. And then people saw those 3D models of, One Manhattan West was a flagship project for Willow originally, and then that expanded across New York. But that was a 72-story high rise, 2.1 million square feet. It's including the basement levels in the middle of Manhattan, right? So massive building, 2.1 million square feet. For people who don't deal with this on a regular basis, it's that's like a big entire education campus, but all in a single stack up in the sky in the middle of Manhattan. So when I mentioned 70 floors up, it's a pretty impressive setting. And then the same, we did SoFi Stadium at the time, and then people went like, "Yeah, this is cool for those who can afford it." And at the time there were setup costs, etc. So we've been hard at work for the 5 years since, 5 years plus. Last 7 years to how do we democratize this. So we bring together, we call this our activate technology, but we bring together all these data connectors with what we call our skills, our AI skills, and those things drive insights with impact scoring, um, and that ultimately drives action. Some of that can be traditional work order tickets through CMMS systems, where we often have bidirectional integration with many of the popular ones that are out there. And in increasingly more cases, we are looking for those autonomous response behaviors, right? Like if there's nobody in the space, why would we heat and cool at the same time? So the reason why that's relevant is that allowed us to basically make these bundles that are very affordable and thematically oriented. So we have what we call our activate packs. Some of them are on sustainability. One of them is around building energy and operations. There's one called active efficiency, where we bring in solar PV, EV charging, and battery storage. We have conveyance. That can be anything from elevators, the walking runways or escalators that you see, to luggage handling at an airport, anything that moves things from point A to point B. We have a pack around kitchen specifically, so people can kind of ladder in, right? So most people start with sustainability and building energy and operations, get those efficiencies, help with the sustainability story. And those are very affordable, right? There's a spatial and static pack as well. Not all of these buildings need the 3D modeling, right? If you have a BIM model, it's actually very affordable to do that now as well and bring that into the mix. So it's basically, that's one aspect of it, is making it affordable. Um, and then two, return on investment. How fast do you see results? Well, a lot of the onboarding procedures that I mentioned used to be done with warm bodies, and we had to charge setup costs for that, are now more and more automated, and use AI techniques to do so. So that's bringing down the price dramatically and the speed to deployment. So typically we can be up, depending on the building, between 30 and 60 days. Um, and then you start to see insights flowing, where you get those impact scores, and within the first quarter, you'll have a very good sense on actual return on investment. And that's what we've often seen, is that we do a deployment on a part of the portfolio, people get rapid return, and then go like, why wouldn't I scale this, right? So there's two expansion vectors. One is I do more of my buildings, and then once you're there, or in parallel, you can say, well, let me explore these other activate packs because this worked. So I want to nibble on more of these other ones as well, right? If they each give me a similar return. And that is very important as part of the solution, which is when I mentioned impact scores, it's a very advanced solution, right? If you look at the state of the art today, is building management systems and what's called fault diagnostics, fault detection and diagnostic systems, FDD. And they've done magical things for the industry over the years, but it's kind of maxed out what you can do with it now. With something like a digital twin, you can get to the next level. And so the impact scores are relevant in that it's not just cost savings or carbon savings, but as I mentioned, we can do calculations around wear and tear. If you do have things like indoor air quality, again, all optional, right? But you can now, there's deep studies from people like um, Joseph Allen at Harvard did an amazing has done years of amazing studies on the impact of air quality on cognition, right? So coming back to the people, purpose, and environments they serve as part of the mission statement, in learning settings, it turns out that if your CA2 levels really go up, you can start to get like intoxication behaviors, right? And at the time when I was at Microsoft, we bought a high quality CO2 sensor that we carried around in the meeting rooms. And then I'm sure you experienced some points in your life where there's a 10 people meeting room. You couldn't find a bigger one, but you have 15 people. You stuff them all in there. And you have a pizza lunch delivered. And, then you measure the amount of times you go close to or above that 900 ppm level, which is not good for you. Then, that was even at top-notch buildings at Microsoft. That happened a lot more than you would think. And so the point there is that if you have the data, you can totally counter that, right? But people will go home with a headache and think they had a bad day, but it really is the building that stuck it to them, right? Now, if the HVAC was aware of, hey, this room is going above these levels and could counteract that, you wouldn't have had that issue, right? So they're all cool examples of how you can ladder up. But it's also an interesting example of impact scoring, and you can start to have calculations on, hey, based on your numbers, this can be the productivity impact, right? So impact scores go across the board. I mentioned refrigeration earlier. It's a very interesting thing in like retail settings. If a cooler or a refrigerator can't hold its set point or goes out altogether, now the regulatory clock is ticking before you have to dispose of the content, right? Turns out that happens a lot more than you think, right? And so even the entities that have been out there and spent a lot of money instrumenting their coolers, modern coolers have this built in now, but even retrofitting their old ones with temperature sensing, etc., turned out that they're still very reactive. And then oftentimes you don't make it in. When you have a food throw, that can be $10,000 to $60,000 depending on the content. Obviously, different for a cooler with yogurt than a cooler with meat in it, right? That's where you get the variation. Now, when that happens, though, now you have all these ripple effects, right? Which is very interesting. because now you have inventory loss because you had to throw out the content. You have restocking fees. You have sustainability impact. Some of that becomes hazardous waste, which may have county by county regulations. You have customer dissat because now your cooler sits empty for a while. You have lost margin, and on, right? So we're aware of all of those things because we can connect to all of the other systems. We can know the content of what's actually in that specific cooler rack. And so we can have an impact score and a timer that basically says, hey, technicians, if you don't get to this in the next 3 hours, this is what it will cost your employer, right? And that creates an ownership mentality. Instead of having a $100 to $200 fix on a compressor or a condenser, you just avoided a 40, 50 grand loss of food with all the sustainability impact around that. And it turns out with big national retailers, this can run into billions of dollars, and it's part of the shrinkage story. And so we could prove, based on the ones who had invested in this historical data, we can prove that if Willow would have been in place, we would have found those issues, and you never would have even had the incident, because we would have seen 7 days in advance, 30 days in advance, something wasn't operating right. We would give you the diagnostics on all the subcomponents, and already get into quite a bit of precision. And so now you have a co-pilot, so the technician now gets hands-on assistance, what tools to bring for the job. When they're on site, they can say, I did this, I got this error. The tools will say immediately, that's what that is about, so you should do this next. As opposed to, I got this error, I need to find the darn manual for this thing somewhere. Somehow it's still wrapped underneath there in the dustbin, or I have to call the headquarters, or it's just not available and I start Googling, right? And I spent hours just getting to page 145 that describes that error. So that's really, in a nutshell, the value of all these things we describe. But it's I love that particular example because it's such a great way to describe impact scoring, which is not just a singular number, right? It brings a whole bunch of variables into play. Same happens at an airport, by the way. If a luggage conveyance handler motor goes out, well, again, that can be a relatively quick and safe and cheap fix. But when you don't get there in time, any piece of luggage that misses the flight can cost, on average, $2,000 to rectify, right? So this is bringing that into the impact scoring, and the time element of it makes it very relevant. So these are all part of the things we do. We're not just creating insights. They are stack ranked, obviously. There's different types. Some of them are commissioning insights, right? We do ongoing and perpetual commissioning of all the equipment. A lot of things are set and forget. When the building gets built, it's handed over. The best ones do an annual commissioning, as opposed to something looking consistently. Sometimes you just have a mechanical flap that has a 180 degree radius. There's something issue with the motor, it only does 90 degrees. It still functions. The rest of the pieces start to compensate for that. You blow a lot more energy out the window as a result, and you just don't know about it because nobody has all these intricate nuances, right? So this is all part of the type of things that we do. Very exciting.
So, like I would usually say, this is a very wide discussion and we could go on and on and on about it. I think we've been about 40 something minutes now talking about this topic. But we have to come to an end for this. So for any listener who wants to learn more about this topic, learn about Willow, connect with you, or maybe work with you or anything else, what's the best way they can reach you?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, a great way is to go to our website. It's willowinc.com. There's a lot of great content on there now, not only what it is we do, but how we do it, right? There's a lot of explanation pages on knowledge graph, ontologies, digital twin, what it is, what the platform looks like, and how it actually works. So it's a great way to go. There's multiple ways then to get in contact with us as you're at different parts of the exploration journey right there. There's great case studies and testimonials on there with videos of key large customers that have seen good results with us, and we're okay to publicly declare that so. So yeah, very useful resources there. There's even a couple of white papers. So I would say, yeah, I obviously extend an invitation to everybody to go and explore and have some fun with it, and then go get on the journey.
All right, so that's willowinc.com. That's willowinc.com. It will be in the show notes for those listening to the episode, and for those watching on video, you're going to see it right at the bottom of the screen, willowinc.com. So you can go on there if you want to connect with Willow, you want to learn more about what they do, maybe connect with Bert to talk more about this topic, cover things I haven't covered in this topic. Visit willowinc.com. And thank you so much, Bert, for coming on the Greentech Pulse podcast today.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Peter. I love what you do, and a bit of a different approach, right? Many podcasts are more cookie cutter. You really explore the whole spectrum, which we all appreciate.
Thank you. I've been learning so much, so most times I can't really help but just let my curiosity take the best of everything. So for the listeners, I hope you've learned a lot about this. If you have anyone who would benefit from this episode, share it with them. If you know anyone who wants to learn more about this topic or is interested in this topic, please share it with them. And if you want to learn more about the Greentech space, new innovations, new technology, new things coming out in the or different possibilities even in the Greentech space, listen to the other episodes. We have over 10. We have a lot of episodes for you to go through till we're out with the next episode. So till then, bye for now.